The marble seats of the Colosseum were never designed for confusion. They were built for theater. For order. For the predictable sound of human beings breaking under the weight of the state. But on this afternoon, the script failed. Down in the sand, the condemned didn't scream for mercy. They didn't beg for their mothers. They laughed. 50,000 Romans sat in an uneasy, chilling silence, watching something they could not calculate. They were watching a system, their system, begin to fail. The Roman Colosseum was not a place of entertainment. That is a sanitized lie. It was a factory. It was an industrial processing plant designed to manufacture fear. For centuries, the empire operated on a simple, brutal arithmetic: you disobey, you suffer, the crowd watches, and the lesson spreads. It was the bedrock of Roman policy. If you were a criminal, a slave, or a rebel, your death was not a private tragedy, it was public infrastructure. The patricians sitting in the marble boxes understood the geometry of power perfectly. They knew that human life was cheap, but the image of an execution was priceless. It was the message that kept the provinces quiet and the legions loyal. It was supposed to be a deterrent, a mirror held up to the disobedient to show them exactly what their future looked like: short, painful, and messy. But on this afternoon, the machinery jammed. Down on the sand, the lions were hungry. Their ribs pressed against matted, yellowed fur, and their eyes were fixed on the group of prisoners huddled in the center of the arena. Any other group would have been weeping. Any other group would have been clawing at the gates, praying to whatever god they could find, or simply waiting to die. The Christians were different. One young woman, her tunic already stained a deep, darkening crimson, didn't look at the beasts. She didn't look at the guards. She lifted her face toward the imperial box, where the emperor and his inner circle sat, and she began to sing. It wasn't a cry of pain. It was a melody. The silence that fell over the stadium was not the silence of an entertained crowd. It was the silence of a group of people who had just realized their favorite tool, the threat of death, had suddenly lost its edge. The guards looked confused. The executioners paused, their chains slack in their hands. The elite in the stands shifted on their cushions, their frowns deepening. Something had broken. The Roman elite lived in a world where fear was the ultimate currency. If you could make a man afraid to die, you could control his mind, his taxes, and his loyalty. But these people were looking at the lions as if they were doors. They were not afraid of the teeth. They were not afraid of the dark. They were not afraid of Rome. And if they weren't afraid of death, what exactly was left for the empire to do? Rome was about to find out that it had been playing a game it didn't understand. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the most efficient killing machine in history was about to lose its nerve. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. Rome did not run on diplomacy. It did not run on philosophy. It ran on a cold, calculated ledger of agony. For nearly a millennium, the empire maintained its grip on 3 continents by ensuring that the cost of disobedience was so visible, so prolonged, and so visceral that no sane human being would ever dream of testing it. Crucifixion was the centerpiece of this industrial process. It was not meant to be a quick exit. It was an engineering project. The architects of Roman death had spent generations perfecting the anatomy of suffering, how to position a body to maximize the struggle for air, how to ensure the victim remained conscious through the dehydration, the flies, and the slow, rhythmic spasms of torn shoulders. When you traveled the Appian Way, you were not just walking a road. You were walking through a visual archive of Roman power. Spartacus and his army learned this lesson in 71 BC. After the rebellion was crushed, the commander Crassus did not simply execute the 6,000 survivors on the battlefield. That would have been a waste of resources. Instead, he lined them up, one by one, along the highway for over 100 miles. Travelers to the capital had to walk for days underneath a canopy of rotting bodies, listening to the wet, labored gasping of men who were dying, very slowly, in the midday sun. That was the baseline of Roman civilization. The state did not just punish you, it turned your corpse into a billboard. It forced you to become a warning to your neighbor. It turned the very act of dying into a public service for the empire. But by the 3rd century, the machine was starting to cough. The bureaucrats in the palace, men like Diocletian, were brilliant, paranoid, and utterly efficient. They were experts in logistics. They knew how to move grain, how to collect taxes, and how to purge dissent. They viewed the world as a series of accounts to be balanced. And in their ledgers, a new problem was emerging. The followers of the crucified carpenter were not behaving like farmers or shopkeepers. They were not responding to the inputs the system was designed to handle. You could throw them to the lions, and they would sing. You could nail them to beams, and they would thank their executioners. You could burn them as human torches for garden parties, and their brothers and sisters would scramble to collect the ashes, treating them like the remains of a king. The Roman administrators were confused. They were not dealing with a political movement that could be negotiated with or a rebellion that could be crushed. They were dealing with a glitch in the software of human psychology. Their primary tool, the threat of the end, had been stripped of its power. And in the high, marble-walled offices of the empire, the masters of the world felt the first, faint, cold prickling of true, existential dread. The machine was still fast, still brutal, and still heavily armed. But it was no longer in control. While the executioners in the arenas were becoming exhausted, a different kind of decay was eating away at the Roman elite. The men at the top, the senators, the philosophers, and the high-ranking administrators, lived their lives according to an ancient, rigid script. Every morning, they walked into the temples of Jupiter, Apollo, and Mars. They burned incense. They consulted the flight of birds. They made offerings to ensure the harvest, the taxes, and the longevity of the emperor. It was a ritualized transaction. It was a trade, a pinch of frankincense for a favor from the divine. But by the time the Christian movement began to saturate the deeper layers of the Roman population, the old gods had started to look like hollowed-out stage props. They were silent. They demanded blood and coin, but they offered nothing in return. When the plague tore through the empire, when the streets were piled with the dead and the smell of rot reached the high floors of the Senate House, the pagan elites fled. They barricaded themselves in their country estates, leaving their own people to die in the gutters. They were self-preservationists. They were built for a world that was comfortable and stable. When the world broke, their faith broke with it. Enter the Christians. They didn't flee. They didn't calculate the risk. They walked into the houses of the dying when everyone else was running away. They washed the foreheads of strangers, they carried water, and they buried the bodies that no one else would touch. It wasn't just a matter of faith, it was a matter of sheer, terrifying organization. They were a network of people who were already prepared to die, and because of that, they were the only people who could actually live. Constantine, watching from the periphery of this crumbling system, was not a priest. He was a soldier. He was a man who measured the world in the only units that mattered to him: legions, taxes, and leverage. He looked at the traditional Roman religion and saw a museum of useless statues. He saw priests who could not even keep their own temples full. He saw a system that was hemorrhaging voltage. He needed an idea that could weld the splinters of a dying world back together. He needed an army that was not afraid of its own shadow. He didn't see faith. He saw a massive, untapped asset class. He realized that the empire's greatest weakness wasn't the barbarian tribes at the gates or the civil wars in the provinces. It was the lack of a shared, unshakable conviction. He watched the Christians endure 3 centuries of the most sophisticated, industrial-scale torture in human history, and he drew the only conclusion that made sense to a man of power: they were the most disciplined weapon on earth. The old gods were a liability. But the followers of the crucified man? They were a force multiplier. Constantine was a man who calculated reality. He did not gamble with his armies unless the math was in his favor. By the year 312, he was a warlord in the north, looking south at an empire that was eating itself. His rival, Maxentius, sat in Rome with the Praetorian Guard, the most elite killers in the world, and the vast resources of the capital. But Constantine had something Maxentius did not: he had a vision that went beyond swords and shields. The historians of the church would later turn this moment into a fairy tale, a beautiful, glowing cross hung in the afternoon sun, a whisper from the heavens, a sudden conversion of the heart. History requires us to be much colder. Constantine was a soldier, and soldiers do not change their religion based on a dream unless that dream is a tactical upgrade. As he marched his legions through the bitter cold of the Alps, approaching the gates of Rome, he didn't need a saint, he needed an edge. He needed his men to believe that they were not just soldiers fighting a civil war, He needed them to believe they were the agents of a power that had already conquered death. He took the Chi, a Greek monogram that the Christians recognized as the symbol of their god, and he ordered his armorers to paint it onto every shield in the army. It was branding. Pure and simple. He was telling his soldiers, in a language they could not misunderstand, that they were no longer fighting for the old gods who had failed to stop the plague or the rot in the Senate. They were fighting under the protection of the one deity that the Roman state had spent 300 years trying to kill and had failed. He was weaponizing the resilience of the persecuted. He was telling his legions that they marched for a god who was more stubborn than Rome itself. The effect was instantaneous. The morale in his camp shifted like dry wheat catching fire. These were hard, cynical men, accustomed to the brutal reality of the frontier. They were not philosophers, but they were superstitious. And when they looked at those shields, they didn't see theology, they saw a promise. They saw a victory that was already written. Constantine understood something the previous emperors had missed. He understood that the Christians were not a fringe cult. They were an organized, loyal, and fearless network that stretched from the coasts of Britain to the deserts of Persia. By painting their symbol on his shields, he was essentially conscripting the entire movement into his war machine. He was taking the most dangerous, unmanageable element in the empire and turning it into his private security force. It was the ultimate maneuver. He wasn't just planning to win a battle at the Milvian Bridge, he was planning to hijack the future of the Western world. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge was not a clash of ideas, it was a collision of steel and water. When Maxentius, rattled by ancient prophecies and bad intelligence, ordered his army out of the fortified safety of Rome to meet Constantine on the open field, he handed his crown to his rival. The math of war had been broken. Constantine's heavy cavalry smashed into the flanks of the Roman line, and the formation buckled under the weight of its own hubris. Thousands of armored men, weighted down by iron breastplates and greaves, were driven into the Tiber. The river, calm and indifferent, swallowed an entire army. When the dust settled, the ruler of Rome, a man who had been worshipped as a god only 24 hours earlier, was dead in the mud. Constantine entered the city not as a savior, but as a hostile takeover specialist. He erased the Praetorian Guard with a single decree, scrubbing their names from the imperial records as if they were nothing more than a bad debt. But the true takeover was just beginning. In 313, he met with Licinius in Milan and signed the document that would be remembered as a noble charter of religious freedom. It was, in reality, a masterclass in financial engineering. It wasn't just about ending the killing, it was about shifting the treasury. By granting Christian clergy a permanent exemption from the munera, the crushing, ruinous civic taxes that had bankrupted the Roman aristocracy for generations, Constantine did something brilliant. He created the most attractive tax shelter in the Mediterranean. Suddenly, the underground survival sect became a gold mine. Pagan aristocrats, who had spent their lives mocking the superstition of the poor, discovered that they were, quite conveniently, spiritually drawn to the new faith. They flooded into the priesthood. They donated land in exchange for bishoprics. They traded their expensive robes for the simple tunics of the church, all while keeping their hands on the levers of power. The persecuted underground had transformed into a shadow government with a massive real estate portfolio. Constantine began pouring imperial funds into the construction of enormous basilicas. He handed the bishops the keys to the cursus publicus, the elite imperial courier system that had been reserved exclusively for senators and generals. The very men who had once smuggled scriptures in fish skins were now traveling in state carriages, eating at stateway stations, and directing the business of the empire. The faith was no longer a path to martyrdom, it was a career path. And like all career paths in Rome, it began to fill with men who were experts at calculating their own advantage. Constantine watched it all, satisfied. He had welded the fragments of his world together. He had the money, he had the organization, and he had the soldiers. He had built his new empire on the bones of the old, and he had done it by turning the cross into a ledger. By the year 325, Constantine had achieved what no emperor before him had ever dared to dream. He was the undisputed master of the Roman world, from the mist-covered forests of Britain to the burning sands of the Egyptian frontier. He had the gold, he had the legions, and he had a new, unbreakable ideology that kept the masses in line. But his new machine had a glitch. The Christians, whom he had envisioned as a single, disciplined army with one chain of command, were tearing themselves apart. A theological civil war had broken out in Alexandria. Bishops were fighting over vowels and prepositions, and their mobs were burning marketplaces and paralyzing the grain shipments that kept the capital fed. To Constantine, this was not a matter of religion, it was a matter of logistics. He had not funded this church, built its basilicas, and painted its symbol on his shields just to watch it shatter his empire over a debate about the nature of God. He summoned the bishops to Nicaea. He didn't invite them to a debate, he summoned them to a tribunal. You have to visualize those men walking through the marble colonnades of his summer palace. They weren't soft theologians. These were the survivors of the Great Persecution. Bishop Paphnutius walked in with an empty eye socket and hamstrings severed by Roman executioners. Paul of Neo-Caesarea showed hands that could no longer close, nerves burned out by iron plates in the interrogation chambers. They were used to hiding in basements, they were used to writing in invisible ink. Now, they were standing under gold-leafed ceilings, escorted by imperial guards with drawn swords, facing a man who wore purple silk and sat on a throne of solid gold. The psychological vertigo must have been absolute. The hunted had become the guests of the hunters, and the hunters were now demanding a single, unified, signable document. Constantine didn't care about the theology. He cared about consensus. He made it clear, through his silence and the presence of his guards, that consensus would be reached by sundown. They drafted the Nicene Creed. With a single decree, he made theological disagreement a crime against the Roman state. Dogma was no longer a matter of faith, it was now the law. And in that moment, the pivot was complete. The bishops looked around the chamber, at the wealth, at the power, and at the soldiers standing at attention. They realized the truth, the sword had changed hands. The early Christians had preached a gospel of the poor and the weak. They had died to prove that power was a trap. But by the time they reached the 5th century, they had become the very thing they were born to destroy. They used the Roman state to execute heretics, to seize inheritances, to outlaw competing thoughts, and to mobilize armies for conquest. Jesus did not Romanize the world. Rome Romanized Jesus. The cross, once a rough wooden gallows designed to terrify rebels, was cast in solid gold and lifted high above the cavalry charges of the empire. The movement that had once been crushed by the arena was now running it. The Trojan horse was fully inside the gates, and the machine that had lived on blood for 1,000 years didn't stop killing. It simply changed the name of the victims. The story of Rome's fall is a lie. Rome never died. It just changed its uniform, traded its marble temples for stone cathedrals, and learned that the most effective way to rule a world is to convince it that your politics are the will of heaven. The leash had been clipped on, and for the next 17 centuries, the world would never truly break free. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.